in the states? James Madison tells us. Again, in Federalist 45, he says, the powers reserved. Now remember how important that word delegated was. It tells us that the states are the higher power and the federal government is the lower power. That word reserved is just as important. So make a star on your paper about that. The powers reserved to the several states. Now that word several, in spite of what your federal supremacists may assert, doesn't mean a few. It means severed and independent. It's an Old English version of the word several. Will extend to what? All. What is the meaning of the word all? Are we sure it still means that? I mean, you have to recognize we do have those in government who want to redefine the meaning of the word is. Right? So we can all agree that all still means all, right? All the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concerns the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the states. What about the EPA, the FDA, and the Bureau of Land Management? Wouldn't that be the properties of the people? Reserved to the states. What about the Department of Education, HHS, USDA, FDA again? Wouldn't that also be the lives, not just the properties, but the lives of the people? Reserved to the states. What about the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, FCC, SEC, FAA, ATF, Department of Energy, and any other three-letter combination you can throw in there? Internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state? Reserved to the states. How do we allow the federal government to exercise a power that has clearly been reserved to the states, not by my interpretation, but by the words of the father of the Constitution?
Amen.
You see, the states were supposed to be left alone to govern themselves internally. The purpose of the federal government was to handle external matters. So why is power reserved? It's a very important word, and its definition changes everything about who we are. John Calhoun, in an argument during the Great Debate of 1830, where the federal government is trying to assume more power than delegated, the states are trying to rein it in, explains the power of the word reserved and the consequences for denying its proper definition. The doctrine which denies to the states the right of protecting their reserved powers. Right. Now we know power is delegated to the states. But why do they have a right? Well, the states have a right to protect their reserved powers by the nature of the word reserved. The word reserved means to exercise dominion over a thing to the exclusion of all others. Because the 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States are reserved to the states or to the people respectively. Why? Because the people created the states, so we hold all the power. The states created the federal government, so that's that hierarchy. People, states, federal. Reserved. We reserve this power to them, which means when we created the states, we said you have the authority to exercise dominion over this power to the exclusion of every other government, foreign and federal. Spain can't come in here and tell you how to manage your land, and neither can Washington, D.C. It creates an ownership. Think about that. If there's a chair on this stage, and on this chair is a sign that says reserved to KrisAnne Hall, what do I have the right to do if somebody sits in that chair?
Kick him out.
Kick him out. If the sign says reserved to KrisAnne Hall, and somebody sits in my chair, and I don't have the right to kick them out, is the chair really reserved?
Nope.
And that's exactly what Calhoun is saying. If they don't have the right to kick the federal government out of the exercise of their power, then the power is not really reserved. You have to use a different word than reserved because it's not reserved. What you have to admit, if the states cannot defend their power, you must admit that it is now the federal government who holds the right to determine exclusively and finally the limit of its own power. Because if the states can't protect what has been reserved to them, what is the limit of the federal government? What keeps the federal government from showing up and saying, you know, we see this power that was specifically enumerated in the Constitution, these few and defined powers that we are to have, but you know, we really don't like that right now. We're actually going to take control of your land. And we're going to take control of your schools, and we're going to take control of your businesses, and we're going to take control of your resources. And guess what? You have to just like it. And if you want to argue with us, you have to appeal with us. If that's the case, then what is the limit to the federal government's power? Its own will. And that means we are not a constitutional republic. That means we are a totalitarian kingdom. Now let me ask you this question. If the states must submit to every exercise of power that the federal government designs, are the states sovereign? No. Now this is really important. Because remember, what kind of document is the Constitution? It's a compact, which is an agreement between sovereign governments. If our states are not sovereign, can they create a legally binding contract? No. If our states are not sovereign, then the Constitution is not a legally binding contract, which means we are not a constitutional republic. It means the federal government exists only by the nature of its own acquiescence of power, by its own will and assumption of power. And we are nothing but colonies and subjects in a kingdom. And that's what he's saying. For the federal government to have the right to determine exclusively and finally the limits of its own power, it's incompatible with the sovereignty of the states and of the Constitution itself, considered as the basis of the federal union. Here's the good news. The states are still sovereign. The Constitution is legally binding. We operate in a constitutional republic. The federal government has few and defined powers, and the states have numerous and indefinite powers. And the only thing that needs to change is this. We have got to start acting like freemen in a republic instead of operating like subjects in a kingdom.